Welcome to Mark My Words. I'm Mark Evans with a behind-the-scenes look at the men and women who make our world a more interesting place. I'm taking a sabbatical from my usual solo format to have an interview with some very interesting guests. We have on our program today a comedian, an author, a columnist, a teacher, a lecturer, a producer, and a clown, among other things.
Do I do
and in
all
fact,
that? Do I do all that?
yes.
No wonder I'm tired.
You've just met the one person who meets all those criteria. Our guest, the irrepressible professor of fun, Tommy Moore.
Hello, Mark. Before you start, I know you want this to be like a semi-serious interview, but I got to tell one joke, otherwise I go nuts. I got to do one joke. We'll do a joke. So this guy goes to the police station. He says, "My wife is trying to poison me. My wife is trying to poison me. My wife is trying to poison me." They said, "Calm down, relax. We'll question your wife. We'll get back to you." Next day they call him up, said, "Mr. Levine, we talked to your wife for 3 hours. Take the poison."
Our very special guest, Tommy Moore, is quite an extraordinary fellow, and he was so eager to make me and all of you laugh that I didn't really get a chance to tell you all about him. But he's had an astonishing career, many years in Philadelphia, and of course is known all over the country as one of the country's funniest men and a leading comedian. He's headlined at over 350 venues, including many times at Caesars and comedy clubs and cruise ships. In addition to that, for 12 years, he had his own newspaper column. He's reviewed other comedians. Now, we talk about the great Jimmy Durante, of course, one of the great entertainers of all time. You have his hat. It is in your collection. It is overlooking us even as we speak.
He gave it to my grandfather at Palumbo's, which was the oldest, longest running nightclub in America. And I was the last Philadelphia comedian to appear at Palumbo's. I was 21 years old. My parents saw me there. It was the thrill of their life. It was the thrill of my life. It was a great, great old nightclub. Everybody had been there at one time or another. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, and I got to stand on that stage. I'll tell you a true story. After it was over, when nobody was around and I made sure nobody could see I was crazy, I literally kissed the stage.
You shared with me the other day a great story about the legendary Red Skelton and what happened to him in his one of his early debuts, talking about audiences and not knowing your audience.
He told me this story. He was 19 years old. It was his first job in vaudeville. And in those days, they did 4 or 5 shows a day. And he was doing an afternoon show, first time at this theater. And he walked out and he did his act, most of which was very visual and very pantomime. And he got no response, not one laugh, nothing. He walked off after his 5 minutes, and the stage manager said, "Get back out there." So he went back out, embarrassed, but he went back out. And he came back in to no applause, and he said, "Get back out there again." And Red Skelton said, "Please don't make me go back out. This is embarrassing." He said, "Get back out there." Red Skelton goes back out there, comes back in, stage manager says, "Go back out there again." Red Skelton said, "Look, I'm not getting any applause. You're right. I'm not good. I shouldn't be here. I'm going to quit the business. You don't have to pay me." Stage manager said, "You don't understand. Go back out there one more time and you'll see what's going on." He went back out. The stage manager brought up all the house lights. And there was the whole audience of Japanese people giving him a standing ovation and bowing. That's how great they thought he was. He thought he had bombed, and they were giving him a standing ovation.
And you said, I think, something very interesting. You and I, again, have talked about the nature of comedy and how comedy has changed over the years. And you, of course, have preserved in your own act and your own writings some of the great classic elements of comedy.
What I try to do is not be angry. What I try to do is be happy and make the audience happy. I do a show. I do jokes and one-liners and magic tricks and props and hats. I do audience participation. I bring people up on stage with me. I brought over 20,000 people on stage with me at approximately 8 or 9 people a show for over 3,000 shows. And I make it a party. I make it fun. I'm not here to be cynical or caustic or angry or bitter. I'm here to send people out there glad they had a good time, glad they're alive, and happy to be here.
We're back with our guest, Tommy Moore, the professor of fun. and we're talking with him about his marvelous new book. Tell us a little bit about the book, Tommy, because one of the things that I find fascinating is that you have a degree in elementary education. You've taught college courses in comedy at Temple University. So apart from making people laugh, you've also worked with corporations and you've taught people the value of humor. And I know it's hard to get a comedian to be serious, but you manage in this book to strike a common ground between being very funny, but also pointing out that you've learned a lot in your life, and we can learn a lot from the wisdom of some of the great comedians.
Yeah, I found out that show business lessons really translate very easily into real life lessons, because there isn't a heck of a lot of difference between standing on stage and standing on planet Earth. The only difference is you got a spotlight on stage. That's really the only difference. And I learned so much from so many comedians. Jay Leno taught me how to find myself. Milton Berle told me how to take a 1-minute vacation, and the easiest way to do it is tell a joke or have somebody tell you a joke, because the minute you're listening to a joke or hearing a joke, you're not thinking about your problems, your worries, your frustrations. Joan Rivers told me not to worry. I was very worried about what kind of material I should do, what kind of material I shouldn't do. She said, just go out there and do it. What works, you keep. What doesn't work, you throw away. Don't worry. Don't judge. Jackie Mason taught me when you frame things beautifully, they look beautiful. If you take a painting and just lean it against the wall, nobody's going to pay attention to it. But if you frame it and put a nice light on it, everybody thinks it's special. You have to do that to yourself too. You have to frame yourself. You have to feel good about yourself. You have to dress well. You have to dress differently. You have to dress in a way that makes you happy. Everything in the book is about happiness. That's why I called it a PhD in happiness. And I learned so much from so many comedians. Alan King told me how important it is to be in control. The number one stressor in the world is feeling that you're not in control. And there's a lot of things we're not in control of, but you are in control of what you think and what you do.
You also, of course, had encounters with the great George Burns.
Yeah. George Burns was 93 when I met him. This was at Caesars, Atlantic City, and I was at a luncheon for George Burns. And people were asking him serious questions, the most serious of which is, why do you do what you do? At 93 years old, you're still out there performing. He said, I do it because I love it. He said, that's what you've got to do in life. You've got to do what you love. And if you're not doing what you love, find out what you love and figure out a way to make money at it. And the funny thing is, you know how comedians always like to make somebody laugh? We sensed that he had been too serious and he wanted to say something funny, so I fed him a straight line. I said, let me ask you a question, Mr. Burns. You've been in show business your whole life. What could you tell a young comedian? What is the best advice you can give a young comedian? And he said, never leave your wallet in the dressing room.
Now, in fact, you actually write in your book about a man named Billy Glazen, who was a legend in the comedy field. And one of the things I think is fascinating about you is that you not only pay tribute to the famous comedians that all of us know, but to a tremendous number of figures in comedy who were very respected in the trade, but who, for various reasons, might not nearly be so well known to the public. And one of them, Billy Glazen, is a man who actually called George Burns Jr.
Billy Glazen was old. We don't know how old he was, but he was old. And he had written for every major comedian in the country. I'm talking about Milton Berle, Bob Hope, Henny Youngman. Billy Glazen put out a thing called the Billy Glazen Funmaster Gag Files. And they were joke collections that he would send out to comedians who subscribed to them. And he just sat in his office and churned out the jokes. And he also taught comedy, and he was like Yoda because he knew everything. You knew when you walked into his office that you should just shut up and listen because he knew what he was talking about. And I talk about him in the book, and I use some of the things he taught me, which interestingly enough were things like, when you tell a joke, don't lie. If you were never fat, don't tell fat jokes. Don't steal. Don't steal from another comedian. Don't do anything that adulterates your act. If you're not a singer, don't sing. Just tell jokes. Never work at a nightclub that you wouldn't bring your mother or your father to. And there were more, and I realized later that these were actually the Ten Commandments. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, honor your father and your mother. But they applied to comedy.
Remarkable. And he put out a comedy encyclopedia, and I think you have just about the only copy left.
Yeah, there were 26 of them. Milton Berle had one, Bob Hope had one, Jackie Gleason had one, Johnny Carson had one, and their writers had it. I have been on the internet trying to see if any of them exist anywhere, and none of them do. I've got the only one. I paid $3,000 for it as a kid, as like a 19-year-old kid. I used every dollar I ever made at a birthday, every dollar I ever made from the Tooth Fairy. I saved it. I bought a $3,000 26-volume encyclopedia of comedy. It is really the written history of nightclub comedy from the 40s through the 60s. And I got the only copy.
We're back with our guest, Tommy Moore. It's been said Tommy is a man who wears many hats, all of them funny. And we've been talking about your incredible collection here. And of course, you have, I think you said 1,200 LP records, as well as thousands of books and video cassettes and pictures and programs and everything you could possibly imagine. Tell us a little bit about your collection, because it is truly extraordinary.
Well, it started with books. True story. I was performing at a place called the Golden Lion Pub in New York, and in the audience I heard was Leopold Fechner. Now, Leopold Fechner was called the man who never laughed, and I was determined to make him laugh. Now, the reason he never laughed is because he was a joke collector. He had every joke book in the world. He had heard or read every joke there was 5 different ways, and he didn't laugh. Well, I was going to make him laugh, and I did. And after he came up to me and he said, "You made me laugh." I said, "Thank you," and we talked. And I said, "How did you start collecting books?" And he said, "I started as a teenager in pre-Nazi Germany. And I had a joke book collection, and when I heard that Adolf Hitler was burning books, I knew it was time to pack up my books and come to America." And that scenario stuck in my mind. And that night on the way home from Penn Station in New York, I bought my first joke book, and now I have over 800.
And you also have a tremendously interesting collection of memorabilia, posters. I see trunks here.
Oh, trunks old theatrical trunks that I've decorated with pictures of vaudevillians and burlesque comics and comedy magicians and stand-up comedians. I loved them. I loved the old guys. They were rock solid. They could make anybody laugh from 6 to 60. And I have so much memorabilia. Henny Youngman's painting from Leroy Neiman's. Henny Youngman taught me a great lesson. I cornered him. I was 18 years old. And he was doing a show in Philadelphia outside. And they used the steps that Rocky from the movie ran up and down. They used those steps as bleachers, and he did a show on a truck in front of those steps. Now, I had seen other comedians do shows there weeks before, and they all bombed. And the reason they bombed was because there were so many distractions. Noise, trucks going by, street vendors. Henny Youngman came out, and he just scored. One joke after another, one joke after another. And I talked to him after, and I said, "How did you do it? How?" And he gave me a little card. He said, "Want to see my pride and joy?" And he handed me the card, and on it was a picture of Joy dishwashing detergent and Pride furniture polish. And I thought it was just a joke, but later I figured out what it really meant. What it meant is if you take pride in what you do and you have joy in doing it, you've got any deterrent beat. That's the lesson Henny Youngman taught me.
Tommy, you've worn many, many hats, and one of your many hats has been that of a producer in the field of comedy, in the field of comedy clubs.
I had a club for 11 years. Matter of fact, this was the jacket from the comedy club. Very big in the 80s. Every place you worked gave you a jacket. I worked Saturday Night Live, I got a jacket. I worked 352 headline appearances at Caesars, I got a jacket. I got I got 42 jackets. I have no pants.
Now, you mentioned your friend Harry, who, of course, was enormously interested in magic.
Yes.
And you, of course, bring up the subject of magic. Johnny Carson, at one time in the early days of his career, people don't know this, was a magician. And there is a great history of magic and comedy. And you, in fact, were drawn to that. And in your own act, you do a lot of comedy magic.
Yeah, I do comedy magic. I do the kind of magic where the tricks don't work. And it's partially because I want to make you laugh, and it's partially because I don't want to practice. If the trick works, you have to practice. You have to make sure it works. I don't have time to practice. So if a trick screws up, it's fine with me. But Harry Anderson, who actually lives in North Carolina now, he lives in Asheville, was one of the great comedy magicians that really pushed comedy magic into the forefront in the 80s. He was a great guy. He was a good friend. And haven't seen him in a long time, but if you ever get to see old Saturday Night Live clips with Harry Anderson on it, you're going to see one great comedy magician.
And this, of course, is in the tradition of the great Carl Ballantine.
Yes, yes, Carl Ballantine, who just passed away this year. Carl Ballantine, who most people know from McHale's Navy, in fact, was a comedy magician for 40 years. And he did the same 8 minutes where the same tricks always screwed up, and you laughed every time.
Now, you say something very interesting. I'm fascinated by your preservation as a collector of these wonderful books and videos and recordings of great classic comedians. And, you know, with the passage of time, there's a tendency for people to forget who were some of the pioneers. And I want to ask you to comment about the sense of the comedians of today really standing on the shoulders of those who have come before.
Absolutely, and they don't realize it, but there's such a tradition. Way back to vaudeville, burlesque, nightclubs, the Catskills, Miami, it all builds, and you have to know a little bit about everything. The same in music. I mean, you have to know about Mozart and Bach and Beethoven. Matter of fact, do you know what Beethoven is doing now? He's decomposing. But you have to know these things. Brahms, you have to know Brahms. Do you know it took Brahms 6 years to write that lullaby? You know why? Kept falling asleep. You have to know what went before.
The other thing I find interesting is that you also touch on comedians who come from not the sort of hip, urban background that we usually think of as the fountain of inspiration for comedy, but you talk about people like Minnie Pearl and Jerry Clower, and tell us a little bit about that, because there's actually, your book closes with a really spiritual emphasis on what we can get from clowning, and there's some serious lessons. It closes with something called the Clown's Prayer.
Yeah, well, Jerry Clower, who I first found out about here in North Carolina, we were visiting relatives in Fayetteville, and I saw in the newspaper that Jerry Clower was going to be in Fayetteville. And unfortunately, the newspaper was like 3 days old, so I missed him. So I went in and I bought an album in a Piggly Wiggly. You can buy comedy albums in a Piggly Wiggly down here. You can't do that in Philadelphia. But I bought the album and I heard about Jerry Clower, who said a very interesting thing. And if you ever get to buy his video, get it. It's called Ain't God Good. Jerry Clower said, I know there's only one place in the world where there is no laughter, and that's hell, and I've made plans not to go there. Later, I played Jerry Clower in a review called Honky Tonk Angels in the Northeast. And people like Jerry Clower or Minnie Pearl, who taught me the most important thing is love them and they'll love you back. That's what you do on stage. You walk out and you love that audience and they love you back. Because love, you know, somewhere in the Bible it said there are three things: faith, hope, and love is the most important. Love is the most important.
Now, for anyone that would like to pick up a copy of your book, how can people get your book?
Go to Amazon.com. You can get it as a paperback. You can get it as a Kindle edition. Go to Amazon.com. Just type in Tommy Moore Happiness. It'll take you there.
Well, this has been just an absolute pleasure to have you here. The time has just flown by.
It's fun.
And you make it, well, as I said, you make it look very, very easy, being funny and being serious about comedy. The book is wonderful.
Thank
and
you.
I do hope at some point you will find the time to come back and join us again, because we've done 2 shows and we could do 20 more with you. You have so many great stories to tell. And there's also a lot to learn from the best of being funny.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Our guest has been Tommy Moore. Be sure to look into his book. And as always, remember, on this show, we respect the best of the past that shouldn't be forgotten, the best of the present that shouldn't be ignored, the best of the future that shouldn't be undiscovered. You can find all 3 of those elements in the Tommy Moore collection, in his book, and in his wonderful comedy. Join us again, as always, and mark my words.